There's several ways we control juniper in eastern Oregon and northern California and Idaho. And really the two main ones are cutting with either chainsaws or some kind of mechanical shear. Could be on a track hoe or one of those skidders that they have. And also we have prescribed fire. And that's been applied probably more frequently over the last 10 years as our understanding of juniper and its impacts have come about. In terms of what type of treatment you choose, it's really going to depend on your management objectives. But if you really look at what kind of treatment you're going to choose, you want to look at kind of your woodland successional phase. And Rick Miller's identified 3 successional phases. Phase 1 is kind of where you have a shrub grassland intact, and there are trees there, but you may not necessarily see them. But they're inside the canopies of those sagebrush plants, or you may see a few popping up here and there. Phase 2 is where junipers are co-dominating the site with shrubs and grasses, and in both Phase 1 and Phase 2, you have the option of applying prescribed fire because you have the necessary surface fuels to carry that fire through the system and remove trees and restore that shrub grassland system. With Phase 3, this is an area where juniper is dominating the site and your shrubs either out of the system or much reduced, and your understory is in the same condition, much reduced, and you lack surface fuels to carry that fire through that system. And so you've got to either cut the trees to remove them, or what we're finding now is on these Phase 3 woodlands, real successful methods been employed by some of the BLM districts in our area is combinations of cutting, and after you let the trees dry, you have sufficient surface fuels to carry that fire through that area and remove the remaining live trees. We've looked at several methods on that, both in terms of how many trees to cut and what time of year to cut, and we're finding on a lot of these woodlands that are dominated, typical Phase 3 woodlands, if you cut about 1/5 to 1/3 of the trees, that'll develop sufficient surface fuels to carry a fire through and remove the remaining live junipers. When a juniper is treated to restore, say, a plant community, you really have to know what's there to begin with. And one thing we encourage people to do is go out and try to identify what species you have. If you have a decent amount of natives in the system, when you treat the trees, you're probably going to get a native community back. But if it's mainly composed of weeds such as cheatgrass or medusa head, and you treat those trees, that's what you're going to get. When those trees are gone, you're going to get a tremendous flush of weeds. So when you do treat those sites, you have to consider, all right, I'm probably going to have to come in and reseed here with something that's fairly aggressive that's going to reduce that weed impact. And what we found on some of the areas we've worked at, which looks pretty barren to begin with, but when you start walking to the site, you start picking up the natives in the system, and we're finding that you need about 2 to 3 native bunch grasses per square yard to kind of recover that site, and that it seems to take anywhere from 5 to 10 years for it to restore to kind of a pretty good native community. The other area we've looked at is the seasonality of burning when you do these partial cuts with prescribed fire. We've looked at both spring burning when you have wet frozen soils and you can still run a fire through these areas. And we've also looked at fall fire. Fall fire is really effective for covering large areas, but it can have some really heavy impacts to the understory. It may take longer for those sites to come back. It just depends on what species you have in the area and what their reaction is to that fire and how severe it is. Usually with the spring fires, we're finding really little to no impact to the understory species. So you get a very rapid response from the grasses, shrubs, and flowering plants. And usually that area comes back within the first year, maybe the second year, but usually the first year you're back up to or exceeding your pre-treatment conditions. So in terms of looking at some of the treatments, mechanical versus fire, mechanical is going to have fairly low impact in terms of the severity of the disturbance, with comparisons to fire, where fire has much more severe effect to to plants, and it generally takes these areas longer to recover after fire versus mechanical. It's a shorter time period, particularly if you have a healthy understory to begin with. It's going to come back within the first 1 to 5 years after a mechanical treatment. Another issue with seasonality of fire is liability. One advantage with the spring burning is you may not cover as large an area, or it may take longer to apply, but your chance of that fire escaping and running onto the neighbors or onto BLM land, where you may become liable for that fire escape, you pretty much eliminate that with spring burning. And also in terms of costs, mechanical tends to be a lot more expensive per acre, particularly if you're doing small unit areas. But if you're doing large areas, fire is going to drop that cost down quite a bit compared to mechanical, which runs anywhere from, depending on the treatment, runs anywhere from like $40 to $200 per acre. Another advantage with mechanical treatments is, particularly if you have sagebrush in the areas, if you do burn in that system, you're going to eliminate the sagebrush for probably a considerable length of time. Advantage with mechanical is if you do come in and do these areas, that sagebrush is going to persist in the system, will increase fairly rapidly after you do the treatment. When these treatments are done, we're not looking at necessarily moving all the trees. In fact, many projects require leaving a few per acre. And in most cases, when you do a mechanical treatment, you don't get the little trees, and in 15 or 20 years they're back. And that's one of the disadvantages with mechanical treatments is you do have to come back in and retreat these areas fairly quickly after you've done your first one. Even with fire, we're seeing on a lot of these fire sites where junipers has put a lot of seed into the ground, we're seeing juniper coming back within the first 10 years after a fire. So it's still there. On all these treatments as well, we try to make sure that the old trees are left on site. So when we do these treatments, it's not a clear cut, it's not a total eradication of the tree. These juniper treatments are expensive, and we try to be as cost effective as we can in terms of treating areas that are going to be most beneficial for either reducing soil erosion and bringing back that site so it's holding soil on site and increasing water capture. It also is benefiting wildlife. Another benefit sort of the taxpayer would be a lot of our juniper woodlands abut ponderosa pine forest, and these are areas that have a tendency to burn pretty intensively, and so part of these treatments are to reduce that fire hazard associated with juniper coming into these areas and taking that fire hazard out.